Okay, welcome back. It is 8/19 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the Cambridge companion to Brentano again. We're going to take a look at the concept of intentionality, and we're going to look at roughly two essays back to back and combine their information. And we're going to look at the triad of action, relation, and direction with regard to intentionality. We'll begin with the first moment of action. The first moment of intentionality is psychognostic action at the Da Kunta threshold of Aristotle's Da Kunta threshold, the action of thought, the initial formation of the secondary object. Intentionality is an empirical observation which does include inner perception or thought examining thought. So it's empirical, but it includes inner perception. And the psychognostic act has as its task to articulate the properties and the laws of the psyche, and the realm of the psyche is the realm of the Da Kunta threshold for Aristotle. Therefore, presentation of secondary object equals the act of presentation, which will include inner perception. And from there we want to move on to relation. And that's where we're going to actually move on to the Da Kunta threshold itself. It's the second moment of intentionality. It deals with psychognostic relation. And it is the realm of forming the notion of the true. And it's the forming the content of secondary object into an object of secondary object, which will become an object of inexistence for Brentano. Secondary object becomes an object of inexistence for Brentano. So this is where we deal with the formed psychognostic state, which is reference to an intended object. Intended object equals state of affairs. And for Brentano, the psychognostic phenomena will always include this inexistence object. It will always include this inexistence object. So intentionality will include relation, the ideal object of inexistence, and direction when that ideal object of inexistence is posited as a practical intended praxis object. So intentionality will include the relation of the ideal inexistence type of object and its posited praxis. Now the substantial bearer of intentionality is the psyche, because this is formed at the Da Kunta threshold, which is the relational realm of dialogue of the psyche for Aristotle. So the substantial bearer of intentionality is the self as psyche. And it will bear the intentionality as a morphe, and a morphe is a form of life model. It's the shape or a bodily form of the true, the notion of the true formed into a bodily type model. And it will move on to the direction phase, where this ideality will take on the form of a servant, to borrow from Kojève, Alexander Kojève in his language. But the ideality will take on the form of a servant when it moves on to direction. But the substantial bearer of intentionality is the psyche of the self that bears the morphe, form of life model of the true. The form of life model of the true. That moves us on to direction, and when we get to direction, looking at the third moment of intentionality as psychognostic positing at the realm of the axis flip, when we flip from ideality to praxis. It's the positing of the direction of the formed object, of the formed object of inexistence. It's the positing of the direction of the formed object of inexistence. So its secondary object is related to the primary object or to the sensate realm. We are positing the mark of the mental, the signification mark of our mental activity, It will include deflection, or the self-referential moment of a positing that will include a return. There will be a return back into the self. There will be a reflexive moment, which Brentano calls deflection rather than reflection. Intentionality is the realm of positing where we can mark the distinction between the mental and the physical. We've got that internal externality of inexistence that is being emphasized here, that internal externality, an object of inexistence. It's key for understanding intentionality here, but it's best understood at this realm of positing. That's when it really comes to the forefront and we can understand it. In the realm of positing, we can see this object of an internal externality as an object of inexistence of the true, of a morphe form of the true. And so that's where we really do form the distinction between the mental and the physical, and we can see this intermediary inexistence type of object, this object of inexistence. Now deflection needs to be commented on because deflection will result in critiquing the epistemological certainty of any posited morphe model. Any morphe model that is posited is subject to the critique of universality, and we have from, especially from Margulis, we have a comment here on that. So when we get to this point, we actually have a critique of epistemological certainty with regard to our positing, the critique of universality, or the critique of recognition. And so we'll take a look at note 4 here under the third moment. There's a 7-part reflexive critique of epistemological certainty. Cultural significance offers reflexive feedback, and all positing selves are encultured selves. Intentionality must remain consistent with its own paradigm of self-reflexivity. Its positing does take a realist stance, and as the real, as a positing of the real or the true, it is effective in influencing physical and cultural domains. Therefore, it must comply with historical interpretation as well, and its own singularity cannot be prioritized without engaging in the critique of a universality of an ethics or an epistemology of recognition. So, an epistemology of recognition must necessarily be taken up to critique the individuality of positing of any notion of the true, of any intentionality as an inexistence object. It must be open to the critique of universality, and the critique of universality in Brentano's system boils down to an intersubjectivity. But it gives us a pretty good look at how the concept of intentionality needs to be defined, and we may have already discerned this from his primary work, but it does help to clarify it, and we actually have the editor here contributing an article, but it does clarify the concept of intentionality and understanding it in its 3 moments of action, relation, and direction. And of course, the second moment is the most important because that's the moment of the Dekunta threshold, or the dokeo threshold for Aristotle, where our supposed truth is refined through dialogue, and then it will be again refined through the reflexive moment or the deflection moment, per Brentano, of reflexive feedback or reflexive recognition. But initially, our critique comes from the dialogue threshold or the Dekunta threshold in the second moment, where we refine that morphe modeling. The morphe modeling gets refined through dialogue of other selves that are also engaged in morphe modeling of their own intentionality. So you've got supposed generalizations being posited from different selves at the Dekunta threshold, and then those generalizations are refined to signification and signification model through dialogue till they can reach a morphe form of life model of intentionality. A morphe form of life model of intentionality. Once they reach that morphe form of life model, then they can move on to the moment of positing, and the moment of positing will include the deflection moment of return, and the critique of the universality of recognition. So it gives us a pretty good look at how things develop in Brentano's thought concerning the concept of intentionality. That puts us up through page 149.